last ending the first population video, part one, I asked you to go take a look at this website and to run this simulation called Sex and the Single Guppy. And it was about an evolutionary biologist named John Andler who started studying wild guppies in the 70s. And this simulation really goes through some of the complexities that are involved in natural selection. And I just wanted you to have a little bit of experience with this before we begun talking about natural selection. So first thing is you can look in these individual pools and kind of see how many guppies are in these pools, and then it also tells you about 3 of the main predators of the guppy. And so there's these different pools down this river that you can look at, and then you can run a simulation. And so what you do is, what the question is they want to know what color variation has to do with how well a guppy survives. And so it asks you to make a prediction, and then you can choose your guppy color, and I chose mostly bright. And then you can choose if it has 1 predator species, 2 predator species, or 3 predator species. And then whichever you chose, you hit run, and you can run the simulation. And these bar graphs over to the side show that show you what's going on in terms of the percentage of the guppies that are represented in the population. So this shows you the total number of guppies. We're in generation 3, 128, 29, it's moving as I'm talking. And it's showing you what percent of brightest, bright, drab, and drabbest that we have. And in order to see natural selection, generally, it takes several generations for you to get some good data. Sometimes it doesn't take several generations, but for the most part, it happens over a long period of time. The problem here, though, with the guppies is that in order to avoid being eaten by a predator, they want to be drab, but in order to have reproduction ability and attract the females, they want to be bright. And so what happens is their mating behavior is part of the kind of playing tug of war here with their ability to stay alive and not be eaten by a predator. So we could let this go on and on and on for a long period of time and see what happens, and it isn't always going to be the same. That's really important to understand. So it may be that you have, and we have 30 of each of the predators in this simulation that I'm running now, but it's important to understand that there could be a disease in one of the predators, and that could affect the situation. There could be a reason why the predators migrate or leave this area or overfished. So there are a tremendous amount of things that can impact this simulation. We're just looking at 2 variables right now, the predation and the ability to attract a mate. So we're going to begin population ecology part 2, and here we're going to start off with natural selection. I hope that many of you were able to go to the Sex and the Single Guppy simulation at PBS. I think it's really helpful to understand how different behaviors, animal mating behaviors in this case, and predation can kind of be conflicting with the guppy population, especially when you look at all the different choices you can make during this simulation and what ends up happening to the brightly colored guppies through the drab guppies. But I hope you were all able to go there and take a quick look at that and run through some different scenarios, because it is very complex. In order for the guppy to attract a mate and be able to reproduce, it's got to be very brightly colored in order for that to happen. But that impacts their ability to avoid predation. And so you have these kind of tug-of-war situations occurring, and depending on what predators for the guppy are there at the time, and maybe other abiotic factors, can impact what that particular pool looks like over time, which is looking at evolution. So in this part of populations, we're going to talk about natural selection and how organisms respond to this environment and how that impacts how they're distributed. And so when we talk about evolutionary time, we're really talking over a long period. It's usually centuries, millennia longer. When we're talking about ecological time, we're talking in minutes if you're bacteria, or yeast, months, years. And those are 2 different time scales that are important for you to be familiar with. But natural selection, generally when we see this over evolutionary time, we tend to see more trends in that than when we look at a smaller snapshot of ecological time. And so what happens here when we're talking about natural selection? We have this population of organisms, and there's a non-random survival. So for some reason, some selective pressure occurs that causes variation. This variation is inheritable. So this is a variation at the DNA level. This is not cutting someone's arm or tail off or dyeing hair. This is when we talk about the selective pressure having impact on variation. We're talking at the genetic DNA level. And so what happens is you have this variation that impacts the inheritance. And so you end up with non-random survival. And those are the organisms that are able to reproduce and to pass this information along to their offspring. And so over time, you see that this natural selection plays a part in what the population looks like and even what the population is able to endure in terms of where it is distributed and where it can be found. Oftentimes, the processes that are impacting natural selection are natural processes of the earth. Plate tectonic movement, forest fires, lightning, volcanoes, tsunamis, hurricanes, and these all can impact what's going on in the area. And it's important to understand that these processes were occurring before humans existed and caused this change in the landscape of the earth, as well as changes in the landscape of the atmosphere and what gases were there and how energy and what energy was available to living organisms. So let's take a look at the Darwin's famous finches. And so I have a bunch of different finches here, three main groups, the tree finches, the warbler finch, and the ground finches. And then it shows you what they like to eat, and it also shows you how they use their beaks to manipulate that food. And so there's a lot of famous work that's been done by the Grants, Peter and Rosemary, on the Galapagos Islands, and they found some information that was very interesting about the finch's beak size or shape. Trees on the islands produce both small, soft seeds that are easy to eat and large, tough ones that regular beaks that require large beaks to break them open and be able to get the nutrition outside of it. And in 1977, the Galapagos Islands suffered a very bad drought, and the trees produced fewer seeds of all kinds. And so my question would be to you is, with this scenario in place, what do you think happened to the average beak size among the ground finches? So we have trees, they're able to produce these small soft seeds that are very easy to eat and large tough ones that you have to break open or crack open with your beak. And I'm asking you, when we had this drastic drought and we had fewer seeds produced, what's going to happen here? So what ended up happening based on the research that they did was that the large beak birds were more successful, and that resulted in more of them surviving and reproducing. So the average beak size increased significantly post 1977. So does that mean that the small beaks went away forever? Does that mean all the organisms with small beaks or the trait for small beaks died away? No, that's not what it means. What it means is that it was there, you just had a majority of the larger beaks. And so there still can be other events that occur that allele for small beaks can return. But maybe the allele is gone forever. It just depends. But it doesn't necessarily mean that small beaks have all died out. It just means that a larger proportion of the gene pool is going to be getting these larger beak sizes, because those are the ones that are able to obtain energy and to have energy available to reproduce. Maybe the small finches are able to live but not reproduce at the same volume as the organisms that are able to attain a larger amount of energy. So when we talk about modes of selection, we can have disruptive selection, which tends to create this bimodal curve, which you see here where you have two peaks, one valley, two peaks. You can have stabilizing selection, and when you have stabilizing selection, what happens is the peak gets more narrow, so the variation decreases when you have stabilizing selection. Or you can have directional selection, which moves towards the trait again, but your variation is going to decrease. But as the variation decreases, it's going to move in one of the directions towards a single phenotype where it's favored. We call this, when you move on this number line, as you can see up here on the stabilizing selection and directional selection, I started everybody off on what we would consider a normal bell curve. The difference between stabilizing and directional selection, stabilizing is going to decrease variation towards the mean, whereas directional selection is going to skew it. So it's going to move in favor of one trait in one direction or the other. So as you can see on this side of the curve now, we're moving away from, or whatever trait that is on the left side, and we're going to see more towards the right side of that graph. Directional selection occurs most often under environmental changes and when populations migrate to new areas, because they're going to be experiencing different environmental selection pressures. Stabilizing or ambidirectional selection, it's probably the most common mechanism of action for natural selection, which is this middle one, and this is where we decrease variation. Whereas this disruptive or selective, also called diversifying selection, extreme traits are favored over intermediate ones. And so the variance of the trait increases, but the population gets divided into two distinct groups. So again, this is the bimodal. This is a reduction of variation moving towards the mean, and this is a reduction in variation moving towards a single trait. So as we're talking about this, I want to show you another way that this can be represented, another graphic that's often used to show these same pressures, disruptive, stabilizing, and directional. Understanding that this disruptive, again, is creating these two curves, which we call bi, meaning the word two, modal. So you have these two traits, and they're on the extreme. Stabilizing, which is reducing this variation over time, moving closer to the mean. And directional, which is going to favor a specific phenotypic trait that the environment has selected for. So here I'm going to show you a photograph of the same location on an island, and these are both USGS photos on the island of Captiva following Hurricane Charlie. And what would happen to a population of birds who derived their diet from the treetops? The population has a wide range of beak sizes. And so what would happen to this population gene pool over time if the new environment favored these small beaks? Over time, which beak would be most represented in the population of birds? So as you notice that after the hurricane, it was stripped of a tremendous amount of its vegetation. Okay, so based on this scenario at Captiva Island following this hurricane, which selection diagram would you predict for future populations and why? So you could, come up with different theories. What I want to know is you to be able to explain why you came up with A, B, or C. It's not just enough to say A or B or C. And so directional selection, because the environment is selecting for smaller beaks based on the new food source. And the acquisition of that source gives the animal with small beaks more free energy. So that would be my answer. And again, the idea here is that the less energy that you have to use to obtain food, maintain your habitat, or attract a mate, is utilized in reproduction. And so that's what's important concept here, is this free energy that's available to you. Okay, so selection after the hurricane was directional selection. It favored one phenotype as it moved towards the small beak. All right, so we're back to the same graph that we looked at in the intro slides, looking at biogeography and the distribution of species. So what we're going to do here is propose answers of yes or no as we go through the next slides, and we talk about the Darwin finches. If nothing happened, there's no disturbance for a long period of time, and the island's trees grow taller and taller over thousands of years, what might happen to beak size? Okay, so let's take a look at our biogeography and distribution of species. Does dispersal limit distribution? Is that a yes or a no? Yes. Areas inaccessible or insufficient time? No. Then move on to the next distribution slide, which is behavioral. Then we go to the next question. Behavioral limits. Yes or no? No? Then we would go on to biotic factors. So are we talking about predation, parasitism, competition, or disease? Yes. If the answer to that is no, then we're going to move on to abiotic factors. And those are divided into chemical and physical. So any answers that you would come up with when you looked at the island and you started to make your hypothesis could potentially be correct if it can be explained. And that's what's important to understand, that you go through this process of understanding what is having the impact here and how that works. Okay, so let's move on to another example. So let's talk about hydrangea. And so hydrangea flower color is determined by pH. And they react to the environment, and ultimately their phenotypic display is based on the pH of their soil. So if hydrangea flower color is affected by light and soil pH, this soil pH exerts the main influence on which color of hydrangea plant will be displayed. And so when we're looking at this is very fascinating to think about it, because it would be nice if one could change the colors of hydrangea as easily as it changes in this picture. But for most of us, it's not that easy. The people who have the most control over the color of their hydrangeas are those who grow them in containers. It's much easier to control alter pH of the soil in a container than it is in the ground. So these in the greenhouse in the top picture are you have much more control over how much light you're going to give them access to and how much pH change you're going to have, versus organisms that are typically found outside. Only hydrangea macrophylla or serrata species have the ability to change this way. And so there are some genetically altered strands or cultivars that make this an exception, but for the most part, only certain hydrangea are able to do this with variations in light and pH. And so this is one of their abilities in terms of how they've been able to, how natural selection has impacted them over time. Here we have fish and maintaining homeostasis in various water conditions. And this is talking about making sure that you understand how organisms are able to deal with the pressure issue as they move further down into the water, and how they are also able to deal with, they have this bladder that fills with gas to equalize internal pressure. And so these fish have these specialized systems for dealing with something in their environment. And these are the fish that have been able to survive and reproduce and pass that genetic information on to their offspring. So what's important here is that dealing with a changing environment and being able to respond, or being able to have the genetic composition to be able to deal with that change in the environment is very advantageous to the success of that organism and its ability to procreate and have other organisms. All right. Let's go back to this biogeography realm. Why do species live where they live? And what factors influence dispersal patterns and ranges? So as we look at this map that's shown here, we're looking at where we find the bulk of organisms and where we have a lot of different types of species. Maybe we're looking at where they have access to moderate climate, or organisms that are able to survive in very extreme environments are definitely going to be found closer to the poles. And it's important to keep that in mind as you're looking at different organisms. We're going to go through a few and talk about introduced species, or what we also call non-native exotic species or invasive species. But organisms do generally have a biogeographical realm that they live in. In the century we're in now, where people are moving around and you're able to import organisms from other places and organisms get let loose, we start to see species in areas where we don't normally see them. And when we talk about that, we're talking about species that have been transplanted from one community to another. And so oftentimes these species that are introduced, they prey on the native organisms and outcompete them for resources. So it's very important to understand how this works. So I'm going to go through a few examples of that. And here we have some kudzu right here in the south. We're very familiar with that, and how that has impacted things. But these species, when they get here, they may move into a community, a new area where they don't have any predators or any pathogens or parasites that impact them. And so what happens is they kind of take over. It's not kind of, they do take over. So let's look at this brown tree snake. It was accidentally introduced to Guam as a stowaway on a cargo ship during World War II. And since then, 12 species of birds and 6 species of lizards have become extinct because that is the base of diet for these snakes. And so Guam has no native snakes to it, but because these brown tree snakes came in during World War II, it has eliminated 18 species since its introduction during World War II. And so because it has no predators and it has to eat in order to survive, it has to be able to obtain energy, and obviously it's done an excellent job of that. We have another example, and again here in the south we're quite used to it, which is the Asian plant called kudzu, and it was brought in by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it was introduced in 1876 to help control erosion, especially in areas in the southern United States. And so they brought this kudzu in because it grew very quickly, it was very tolerant, and they brought it in to reduce erosion. And what ended up happening is the kudzu found itself to be a very aggressive organism and highly tolerant, and that it literally just took over other plant species in the area. And you can drive down lots of highways and see that. So here is a sign from the Florida Board of Parks and Historic Memorials. Kudzu, brought to this country from Asia as an ornamental, was developed near here in the early part of the 20th century and given to the world as a soil-saving, high-protein forage plant by Mr. and Mrs. C.E. Please. The fast-growing, deep-rooted leguminous vine has been widely grown in the U.S. as a drought-resistant, erosion-controlling plant that compares with alpha in pasture and haymaking values. So you would have to wonder, they meant well, but now we have this invasive species that's taken over lots of species of plants and fungus and trees that it has overtaken. So now we're going to talk about another organism, the European starling, and this was brought here in the 1890s. And in the intervening 100 plus years, this population has grown to over 150 to 200 million birds across the U.S. And so the coloration is magnificent from egg to adult, and you can understand why they were so popular and why Shakespeare, as it talks about in this slide, he introduced it to North America because every bird mentioned by Shakespeare was the starling. And so again, while you can understand why that is a beautiful bird because its coloration is so nice, it has, unfortunately, the starlings continue to haunt us because they are much better than skylarks and song thrushes in terms of their abilities to survive and to garner free energy. Okay. And now on to the zebra mussel. So this is a native species. This is an invasive species in the U.S. And it's native to the Caspian Sea and Eurasia and Black Sea. And it's become invasive not only in the United States and North America, but Great Britain, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and Sweden. And they disrupt the ecosystem by monotypic colonization. And they damage harbors, ships, boats, water treatment plants, power treatment plants. As you can see, this here is a shopping cart. And water treatment plants have been the most impacted because the water intakes bring the microscopic free-swimming larvae directly into the facility. So they're able to cling onto these pipes and literally take root there and clog them. So it's really quite frightening how quickly they've been able to get in because of their size and how quickly they're spreading. So let's take a look at the zebra mussel range from 1988 until 1999. And as you can see with this one break right here in the Great Lakes in 1988, as we move down 11 years later, we're seeing zebra mussels all through the Great Lakes and tributaries all the way down into Louisiana, because they're very hardy and they are able to adapt quite easily to different environments. So invasive species, before we bring a new species in someplace, it's really important to understand that organisms live in an area where they live and they can be held in check in that area, and that the biogeography, when humans start messing around with where things live and where things are, we can oftentimes unintentionally impact native organisms and take their source of free energy from them and their ability to survive in a given area. This is the slide that shows how a population of fish distributes itself over a temperature range. And some of this population actually does very well at these extremes. And I wanted to point this out where you have this zone of physiological stress, but you have a few little fish out here on the ends of this bell curve that do okay. But for the most part, the organisms really want to stay in this optimal range. And this variation in this population of fish is really important for their survival. So when we talk about why we want diversity and why diversity within a population is so important, is that the diversity, when we talk about that at the DNA level, is that we have all these different genes, that these fish have different combinations of genes, and that some of those give them an advantage to tolerate maybe a wider range of temperature, or maybe even some of them have the ability to tolerate a low temperature or a high temperature. And so what happens is that because pH and light intensity and other abiotic factors are going to play a role in survival, having this variation gives this population a chance to survive. So that if the temperature of this water increased or decreased by 10 degrees, this entire fish population is not necessarily going to die off, because it has species, because of the population has within it organisms that have in their gene pool the genes that make it tolerant of that temperature change. So it just increases the chances of survival whenever you have variation within a population. So when we talk about why diversity is so important, we're really talking about ensuring that population is able to move to the next generation should something happen, a drastic climate change or a drought or some other very strong natural phenomenon. This is one of my favorite things to talk about that kids and students are most familiar with where I live, which is the snakehead fish. And we've had problems with it here in Virginia in the Chesapeake Bay. But I want to talk a little bit about it. It is an invasive species because it alters the aquatic food web. And especially two large species that they kind of look like mudfish, but they're not. Or bowfish. Bowfish or mudfish. And the bowfish is a hardy species that lives in swampy, vegetated waters, like the snakehead, but it can breathe oxygen directly from the air. And it feeds on fish, crayfish, vegetation, insects, so it has a very broad diet. And through evolutionary convergence, these unrelated fish resemble each other and occupy this similar niche. So the bowfin, which occurs mainly in the Mississippi River area, as well as the Atlantic coast drainages north through the Chesapeake Bay, and it's also found in the Great Lakes Basin. The presence of this snakehead in North America is a really great concern because it is very hardy fish. It has few predators. It can disperse widely. It has a high tolerance for a wide range of temperatures and environmental conditions, which means it acclimates very quickly. And once established, this species will be virtually impossible to eradicate. So I'm going to show you a slide, if I can get it to come up. Yeah, I'm going to scroll that over. That talks about that.
I'm John Odenkirk. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. We are in Fairfax County, just off of Route 1. It's called Dove Creek. This is a tributary to the Potomac River, and we're doing some backpack electrofishing surveys, primarily looking for snakehead fish, northern snakeheads, but also looking to see what else is here.
Got a youngie here.
Potentially, this fish could, alter the ecosystem and would be a competitor to the space that currently the largemouth bass provides. So because of that, and just for the pure science issue, in fact, we've got an invasive species potentially restructuring the aquatic ecosystem, we will obviously want to be able to track that, even though at this point there's probably nothing we can do to stop it or maybe not even slow it down. But I think it's important that we understand what's occurring and be able to document it.
This is an incredible amount of biomass. Not just the snakeheads, but of, as you can see, bluegill and pumpkin seeds, brown bullheads, killifish, a few gizzard shad mixed in, a few crappie. Unbelievable to see this many fish packed into such a small stream. Nice.
Some of the attributes, the physical and capability attributes of this fish were grossly overstated. Some of the initial reports, I think it was made a great media story, the frankenfish and the walking across land and attacking small dogs, but all that is of course greatly overstated. The movies notwithstanding, this fish does have a high capacity to tolerate poor water quality conditions, and it does have some competitive advantages on fish like largemouth that are more prevalent here, such as a protracted or repeat spawning season, such as a dual parental guarding of the brood, which might give them a competitive advantage. We're just trying to gain information about the fish, where it's occurring, is the range expanding, are the densities increasing, and biological characteristics about the population, growth rates, fecundity, mortality. Yeah, we're stuck with them. Even if we tried to mobilize and do everything known to science and fisheries to remove these things, we wouldn't even come close. If you wanted to list the attributes of a desirable food and sport fish, you look at the northern snakehead, and there you go. I mean, you have a fish that, based on all accounts that we've had from anglers that have caught them, hits anything that it's thrown at it almost. So it doesn't show a preference for any particular bait. It hits with gusto. It fights hard, and it tastes good. Supposedly they're fantastic eating, and they're prolific and they grow fast. So it seems like this certainly could be, if you look at it for a silver lining or the glass half full, that this could be a fishery that maybe at some point some will actually come to know and love and appreciate, but at this point we're still concerned about potential downside. That we see, especially working in an urban area such as this in Northern Virginia, Fairfax, I work in Arlington counties, Alexandria, and you'll see a lot of exotic fish like Oscars or things you expect to see in a pet store, aquarium trade. What happens is people either they're moving or they can't afford to feed the fish, and it's not necessarily just fish. It could be plants in an aquarium. It could be some sort of house pet in terms of a little furry creature. And they don't want to kill it, but they have to do something with it, so they tend to take it out to the nearest woodlot, the nearest pond, the nearest stream. And that's where we end up with problems. You look at the zebra mussels and the catastrophe and the economic damage and the millions that's caused. And it doesn't take long to realize that the snakehead just is a reminder of what can happen if they're taken out of their proper place and put somewhere where they really don't belong. They haven't evolved. They haven't become adapted to that system. So that's a good reminder for everyone to kind of be careful with what they do at a personal level because things can have economic and ecological impacts.
Okay, so I just thought that was a very interesting video to hear from the Game and Inland Fisheries, and also their idea of using it as a sport fish would be a way to help get more removed from waters where they are, and help maybe keep that population in check to an extent. So here we have an inquiry question: does feeding by sea urchins limit seaweed distribution? And so there was a study done, and I think I've shown you this in an earlier PowerPoint, but we want to talk about this for a minute. So what I would like you to do is to have you design an experimental protocol and have you justify your choices. So you should come up with some options from a study site adjacent to a control site where you have 2 different organisms that eat seaweed. You have the limpets and you have the sea urchins. And you're going to design an experiment to figure out which ones does feeding by these sea urchins limit seaweed distribution. But you're also going to have the limpets involved because they're another predator of the seaweed. So if we were in class, you would formulate an experimental design aimed at answering this inquiry question. Oops, not in the show. And so here we have some data that was collected by a study that was done, this original study that was done at the University of Australia. And so here's what happened. So we have the control, which is the red, where both the urchin and the limpet were present, and you see that you had very little seaweed coverage. We took the limpets out, and you can see this blue line here represents the seaweed production. We removed just the sea urchins, and this black line represents what happened when we took the urchins out to the seaweed production. And then you have this purple line when we took both the limpets and the urchins out. And so, you know, we would ask you to be able to interpret these without the words here, maybe on an exam, or to be able to look at a graph and make some descriptive analysis in terms of what occurred. So this is a lesson in isolating variables. So if any of you want to become research scientists or physicians or any kind of problem solving, this is how you would isolate a variable. Since both sea urchins and limpets are predators of the seaweed, removing both should have a dramatic effect on the seaweed growth compared to the control site, which is the red line. And so, and that's exactly what happened. But it's still a lesson because look what happened when we just took the limpets out. Sea urchins are very aggressive predators. And so even when you took the limpets out, the sea urchins were still able to get in there and just chow down on the seaweed so that your seaweed percentage coverage or the amount of seaweed in this area is still very low when you remove one of the predators. But when you remove the sea urchin, you can see that the limpets, while they are a predator of the seaweed and were consuming, obviously the difference between the black and the purple line, were consuming that amount of seaweed, they still were not as effective predators as the sea urchin. So being able to isolate these variables when you remove a predator and look at the different predators and their impact on their prey helps us understand what's going on in a community or in a population of organisms. So removing both, it only increased the seaweed cover, but when you just took the urchins out, you still had a significant difference from when you only removed the limpets. Okay? And in closing, I want to talk very briefly about this relationship between temperature and precipitation. And I'm showing here just one of the many diagrams that's available that looks at the different biomes around the world and shows you the annual mean precipitation versus the mean temperature. And so where you have very little precipitation and very drastic temperatures, you're tending to have these deserts. And as you move more towards the left of this diagram, where things are more temperate and you have an adequate amount of precipitation, you tend to have more of the areas that are inhabited by more organisms and inhabited by organisms that don't necessarily have the tolerance range that organisms on the left and right side of this graph might have. And so understanding this relationship between precipitation and temperature will help you have a really good idea generally about where biomes are located and why. And another visual that your teacher may have had you work on is to make a climograph. And those are very common graphs where one side of the y-axis is temperature and one side of the y-axis is precipitation. And you look at that over time to identify different biomes. But this is a generalization of where those biomes can be found based on the relationship between precipitation and temperature. And so this year you should spend a tremendous amount of time in your science classes looking at graphs and being sure that you can make an interpretation of them about what's going on and that you're understanding relationship when we have a graph, that there is a relationship in terms of what type of biome exists where and why. And it is primarily based on temperatures and the annual precipitation. So, and the organisms that are living here are going to be impacted by these abiotic factors, and so it favors different organisms in different areas. So this is the end of population ecology.